So let me sort of welcome you to the Natural History Museum Herbaria, throw open the virtual doors to our various collections to you. And I say it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to a bigger audience than we could have fitted into our flat theatre. So the collections that we currently have, something like 4 million botanical specimens. It's of particular interest, as I'll show a little bit later, in that we have very many early modern specimens, so specimens which date from before Linnaeus came up with the very useful binomial system. And within the walls of our building, both the old and new bits of the structure that you can see here, we have something like 800,000 British and Irish flowering plant specimens and about 40,000 British and Irish ferns as well, and a huge number of cryptogamic plants. And I think the cryptogamic herbarium, which again you'll see a little bit later, is perhaps one of the most significant parts of the collection. So if I can lure you away from flowering plants at some point, then we'll certainly, you'd be well rewarded by coming to see our collections there. We also have probably the biggest collection of natural history art in the country as well, and a very extensive library which you can book to use, consult the floras and other things. So here, the contrast of the old and the new, and I've sat in both, and I have to tell you that the new is as chilly as it looks there. We have this sort of rather splendid wood that we had in the old herbarium, for those of you who visited there. While it was a very characterful space, it was also not a very good space for the looking after the specimens. Huge fluctuation in temperature during a day and across the year, and lots of places for bugs and other pests to get in. So we, about 10 years ago, moved across into our new cocoon, where we have climate controlled, compactorized space, where we can pack away our things and look after them in a much better way, even though it looks rather soulless and isn't a place to dwell for too long without getting hypothermia. So while space is always an issue, and this has dominated sort of what we do and what we can pack into where, we are always still keen to add to our collections. We want to keep the collections relevant. One of the important things about the herbarium is that it has this amazing run of material dating back more than 300 years. And as a consequence of that, we can ask all sorts of questions of that material, which is sort of largely sort of randomized over time and geography. And it would be a terrible thing, I think, were we not to maintain collections, to keep these things going forward, so that we can look at what is a very dynamic and changing flora and be able to capture that and use this as a scientific resource going forwards. So one of the projects which we have been involved in over the last 3 years or so has been funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. And this was taking the collections of the Lincolnshire Naturalist Union, the collections largely of the gentleman in the middle here, the Reverend Adrian Woodruff Peacock, a very early ecologist. And this historic collection amounts to about 9,500 specimens, not just Woodruff Peacocks, but some early ones he'd assembled, and also later collections from Joan Gibbons, who wrote the first Flora of Lincolnshire, which came out in 1975. And it's been very interesting to take this material on. It was sadly, as many of our collections in outlying areas are, was threatened. We've been able to bring it in, mount it all up, and are in the process of databasing and digitizing all of this. And as a consequence of that, we are finding new records which had slipped through unnoticed, particularly in Joan Gibbon's material, which hadn't always been worked up to the species level. So we have a Kerik down the bottom here, which she completely overlooked. One of the other aspects of this project, though, which is really lovely, is the fact that we are aiming to make contemporary collections as well. And this has been a very active process in Lincolnshire, reaching out to a wider community to get people involved in identification of plants and showing them the worth of herbarium specimens, because herbarium specimens can be used in a wide variety of ways. And the keen-eyed amongst you will have seen this specimen already flashed up in Sandy Knapp's introduction to the day. There are very many ways that specimens can be used, and the specimens themselves often have a very interesting history, whether it be in the annotations which are on them and the way they record changing thoughts about plant identities, but also they can tell you a little bit about the history of the building they've been in. And here we have Potamogeton acutifolius, which just about managed to survive the Blitz. Incendiary bombs came through the herbarium roof and set fire, particularly to the piles of Potamogeton, which were underneath them. It's just as well this survived, because this specimen, which was collected by Sir Joseph Banks in about 1795, is the only record for Lincolnshire of this species. And we can see from the distribution map that this is by far and away the most northerly site for this species, which has continued to decline. So this acts as a voucher to prove something was where it has been recorded in the past. And we can use these specimens to map the decline, the level of decline and the extent of decline, which is very important for conservation actions. As I say, Banks was obviously a very influential figure in the development of the museum and its collections, and we're very fortunate that we have about 680 of his British specimens. If we just look at another of those, again, historically, this is a fascinating thing. This is Tefracris palustris, which sadly has been extinct in the British Isles since about 1899, when it was last seen in Norfolk. Again, this is the only Lincolnshire record of this specimen, which is about the most northerly, certainly on the eastern part of the country, of this. And this is a voucher which shows that this species was present in the British Isles, but also in Lincolnshire, and documents the incredibly rich flora that sadly Banks was largely responsible for the destruction of when he managed to get the East Fen drained to provide agricultural land and an economic push for his county of Lincolnshire. Another of Banks's specimens, again, these things are really important because they're often the first record of a species or a taxon. In this case, we have the tall-flowered thrift, and this helps exemplify another reason where herbaria can be vital, because you have a voucher, you have a physical specimen where you have critical taxa, which are later divided. You can then go back to look at the original material and decide which of the segregates you possibly have. So here with the tall-flowered thrift, this was a very distinctive subspecies which had been overlooked until it was published by Lowsley and Gibbons in 1957. This specimen was collected by Banks probably about 1795 in this area called the Lincoln Heath, which was very much more extensive area which was developed very early, extended across into Leicestershire. And this species we now know from just virtually a single site, famously in the churchyard at Ancaster and the fields round about. And it's been a plant which the Lincolnshire Plants Project obviously is seen as very much an iconic one. And if we look at the slightly embarrassing current BSBI map in the middle, the green dot will show you exactly where I'm speaking from today, because that's my house, and the picture below is where this species, which I was helping to cultivate and bulk up for some translocation work, has sown itself out of my front gate. Sadly, it's no longer with us. It was a very ephemeral thing. It was just where my wheelie bin gets parked outside, so it got decapitated fairly rapidly, but that's why we have this green dot there. So we saw there a species which, a critical subspecies which went unrecognized for a very long time, but the herbarium material was there to help. And this is a more recent example, and one I do tend to show people as they come to the herbarium. This is Kerik sespitosa. It's one of the Kerik's nigra group, and its discovery in Britain was very serendipitous, in that we had this herbarium specimen, which was collected by John Doney back in 1960, which had been in the collections, just sort of sitting there in the Kerik's Elata folder. And it was only when some visiting Spanish taxonomists came, who were looking at the Elata group more widely across Europe, came down to the British and Irish herbarium just to see what we had, went through the folder and realized that there was this example of a species which hadn't before been recorded in the British Isles. As a consequence of that, contact was made with Trevor James, the late Trevor James, who's much missed, the Vice County Recorder for Hertfordshire, who realised that this site had been destroyed, but went back to other sites for Kerik's Elata in that adjoining area, and refound this plant at Bruffing Meads, where the other photographs are taken. So 48 years after this species had been collected, it was finally recognised, and this is still the only known British site for this very rare sedge. It's often said that if you want to find a new species, go to your local herbarium. The stuff is sat there, sort of on shelves, misidentified, or in some cases not identified at all. And it's the best place to find things, short of sort of, if you can't disappear off to the latest bit of rainforest. Another Kerik, which I should sort of, is a little bit of a diversion really. We have what we now call the auxiliary collections. These are what we previously had as the backlog, a huge pile of boxes, which was rather embarrassing to us. Old material from past members of staff, donations from other sites, which we hadn't got around to processing. And we've been going through this fairly recently. John Hunnex, the herbarium curator, has spent an awful long time working sort of very diligently on this to bring this stuff into the light, so that we get to know what's where, so people can use it. And one of the things which turned up in the collections that Pugsley had put to one side was this specimen of one of the fraudulent Kerites collected by Heslop Harrison on the Isle of Rum. This is Kerik's bicolor, which is a largely North American species, which we think was certainly planted in that part of Rum. And here we have the specimen which vouches for that. And perhaps at some stage we can do some DNA work on this and see where it maybe really did come from. So that's, I say, an interesting side. If I drag you from British and Irish herbarium up into our sort of inner sanctum, as it really is, this is the historical collections room. And before I tell you about the major part of this room, which are the Sloane collections, I just have to sort of mention a particular personal hero of mine, John Ray. John Ray famously didn't like herbarium specimens. He liked to see live plants. He thought they were so much better to deal with. But he did make a small collection of plants, and that small collection of plants still survives, and we have it here. And in that, there are very few British plants. It's mainly a collection of plants collected on his European trip, which was published in 1673. But if you do go through these sheets, you do find some really exciting and interesting things. And I'm trying to convince you that the really exciting and interesting ghost of a specimen, which you see in the middle here, is particularly fascinating, certainly to me, because this is a plant that I've worked on. So what you can see there are the little pinholes of where the unstitching has been done. It's suspected, this is probably very scurrilous, but it was suspected that some of Ray's more interesting British specimens were half-inched by Sherard back in the sort of mid 1700s. And what should have been here, you can just see the traces of, is the very first collection of Bartzia alpina. Right next to it is possibly the first British collection of Galium boreali from the same site. And the pictures show this site. It's really nice. It's very clear exactly where he collected these things, and they still grow in the same place today. The Bartzia, this is Broadfell on Alton, which is one of the most fantastically biodiverse hotspots in the country. The plant still grows in exactly the same spot, the rivulet that Ray would have crossed as he walked from Alton to Crosby Ravensworth. He collected that in the summer of 1668, and it's amazing to think it still survives. Probably the same plant, actually. Time for a shameless plug of the book, The Collectors, which we have just produced, which gives a really lovely overview of the collections in Hans Sloane's herbarium. This is a herbarium of just over sort of 330, 340 big bound volumes. And the pages I'm showing you here are from, on the right-hand side, a volume HS54, which was that owned by William Corton, who died in 1702. The central picture is a volume owned by Robert Plott, who gave us the natural history of Oxfordshire in 1677, died in the 1690s. I think he was run over. And these two sheets show very many of the same plants. They were both collected by Edward Lloyd, who I write about in The Collectors, who made many very interesting first collections of British and Irish plants, montane plants. And here we have a selection of ferns collected by Lloyd in Snowdonia in the 1680s. And they represent the first gatherings of very many things. Here we have Palustris longitus, we have Woodsia alpina and Woodsia ilvensis. We also have the first recorded examples of Dryopteris expansa, and we also have on both sheets a very peculiar sort of Cystopteris, a glandular Cystopteris, which we only really put a name to last year or the year before as subspecies Houtri, which still grows in exactly the same cave where Lloyd collected it back in the 1680s. Another collection from the Sloane collection. This is one of the collections of Leonard Plukenet. And again, this is the first British example of this very exciting little plant, which was long thought to be extinct in this country, but then was rediscovered in the late 1980s, early 1990s by Simon Leach and Co. in Essex. This is Atriplex pedunculata. And what you have to do often with these specimens to work out where they're from is to refer back to the associated literature, because so often they're not actually specifically identified on the sheets themselves. And we know this was collected in the Boston area by Plukenet in the 1680s, 1690s, and was mentioned in Ray's Historia Plantarum, the first edition in 1686. So, time to drag you to the crypt, another part of my sort of area of responsibility is the fern herbarium, which is the first bit you encounter as you come into the crypt. And here we have, as it says here, about 310,000 fern specimens, of which, say, 40-odd thousand are British, and the largest bryophyte herbarium in the world. And here, I just wanted to show you a few of the specimens that we have with sort of different stories attached to them. As in many cases, there's an over-representation of rare species. There's also, we see in the past that people really like to fill their sheets with stuff. And the rarer it was, the more they wanted to put on there. So we have this sort of eye-wincingly over-collected sheet in the middle of Ophioglossum lusitanicum. Tiny little plants. This was from Guernsey. Probably there's not many more plants still on Guernsey at the minute than we have on that one sheet. Equally impressive, the Killarney fern on the other side, which makes for a very spectacular show, but you do have to sort of worry a little about those sort of collecting habits, which took so much when so little was really needed for a voucher. In the centre, again, this is one reason why herbaria are so important, where you have contested species and you actually have a voucher to prove something. So this is Batricium matricaerifolium. This was collected in Ayrshire in 1887. It's the only known example of this species from Britain. It was possibly a casual occurrence, but it could be overlooked. It could be out there still. Phytogeographically, there's no reason why we shouldn't have it and other moonworts. And of course, only a few years ago, the molecular work showed that we probably did have another moonwort here. And then finally, one of the joys of having herbarium specimens is they help remind you of places, of people as well. You look through and you see specimens collected by heroes and friends who are heroes. Here we have Arthur Chater's very interesting Isoetes hybrid between Leucostris and Echinospora. And actually the form that we have in this country isn't quite the same as that described in North America. So it's likely that this is going to become the type specimen of a Notho subspecies of Isoetes crosshickii. So that's really all I wanted to say. I wanted to leave you with this sort of message of yes, we'd love to hear from you. Yes, as soon as we can, welcome you back through the doors. Please come, use our collections. If they're not used, there's little point having them really. And if we have any inquiries, just get to me or to Alison for the Fern Herbarium, John for the British and Irish Herbarium, and we'll do what we can to help you with that. At that point, I will stop sharing my screen and reveal
Thank you very much, Fred. That was really, really interesting. Our herbarium tours are usually really oversubscribed, which means not everyone gets a chance to see them. But that's not a problem this year, which I think is really great. I should also say that being from Guernsey, there are more plants of Ophioglossum lusitanicum on that sheet than are left in Guernsey. We do have a couple of questions, one from Dawn and one from Catherine, and they're both asking about digitization. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Are the NHM digitizing their collections, and what kind of collections are being digitized? Where are they being put?
Yeah, no, I think all museums are very, very keen to make their collections as accessible as possible, and we have a very big push on digitization. You realize though that when you've got 4 million specimens, that's going to take quite a while. We started out by prioritizing our type specimens because they obviously have a considerable significance to the research community. I have to say that certainly for the British collections, far fewer than probably 5% have been digitized to this point. I think people often assume these days that everything we have is sort of available through the data portal, and if it doesn't appear on a database somewhere, then it doesn't exist. There's a huge wealth of stuff out there which we haven't been able to process yet. One of the big things that the museum is currently involved in is a huge development which is going to take place out at Harwell, which is part of its function is going to be as a digitization center, because we need to come up with ways to crank through this huge body of material that we've got. I guess with herbarium sheets, they are fairly easy to process. It becomes much more difficult if you've got a bryophyte packet or something like that, or something microscopic that you need to image to make it useful, rather than just give you the label data. But things like the Sloan herbarium, where you have those huge bound volumes, they pose real problems to how you actually digitize those without damaging the material. Yes, we could unbind them, but in many cases, actually the construction, the paper, all those other things are as almost as great a scientific significance as the little bits of dead stuff stuck to them these days.
Yeah, I can see how it's probably, it seems like a insurmountable challenge when you just have so much material.
I mean, certainly with the Lincolnshire plant material, we've managed to image and actually mount image and take pictures before and after, and then get into our data pool. Something over 6,000 of those 9,500 specimens now, and we're sort of cranking through those. So once you've got a system set up, and people really, sort of trained to do it, then you can crack through things fairly fast.
Okay, I think we've got time for perhaps one more question from Dr. M. Jonathan. He says, I always think of the interplay between botanists and colonialism when I see the Sloan collection, and is that a topic that you've covered in your book?
It certainly is a topic which is mentioned, yes. James Del Burgo, in his article in the book on Sloan himself, obviously refers to this, and several of the other contributors where those people have particularly strong links to the slave trade and things like this. This is mentioned there. It wasn't something which was quite the sort of the topic of interest that when we were first thinking about the book. So it's been sort of either quite timely or sort of so it's certainly interesting that it's come out at this period where this question has really blossomed, and I think it's something that all of us museum curators do now need to think very carefully about how we can start to think about decolonizing, if that's the right word, some of our collections, and trying to explain to people that it's a very much more sort of nuanced thing than sort of the very black and white sort of good bad sort of things which are being sometimes sort of very hastily sort of thought of.